Hello and welcome to this British Academy event. I'm Farhana Haider. I'm a journalist and broadcaster and a presenter of the BBC World Service programme Witness History, which looks at important events in history as told by the people who were there. Today's event is the 10th in a series called Why History, in which we will be joined by British Academy Fellows and funded researchers to discuss insights from the past to help us make sense of the present. I am delighted to be joined this evening by Professor Julia Sallabank. Julia is Professor of Language and Policy Revitalisation at SOAS University of London and is an internationally recognised scholar whose work has played a significant role in establishing the study of language revitalisation as a valid academic field. Julia is a recent recipient of a British Academy Leverhulme Small Research Grant and the British Academy Writing Workshops programme funded by Bayes, and has worked closely with local communities in the places where she has undertaken fieldwork. Julia and I will be in conversation for about 40 minutes before taking a selection of audience questions. If you would like to ask a question, please submit this via the Q&A function. You are, of course, also welcome to tweet during the event and can copy in at British Academy. Welcome, Julia, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Julia, let's start with a really startling statistic. It is thought that at least half of the world's 7,000 odd languages will be lost this century. Why are languages disappearing at such an alarming rate?
Okay, I mean, there are a number of reasons, but the major overall cause is the marginalisation of minority people. A language such as English or a major language such as French, for example. I would say Spanish, but actually in the US, Spanish is pretty much a minoritized language. Mm-hmm. Any language which is not the major national language, major official language of a country is pretty much in danger of not necessarily dying out, but people shifting away from it, shifting towards what they're perceived as more useful languages. Mm-hmm. So there are ideological things going on with regard to language attitudes, how people perceive themselves as well as their languages, people perceiving a certain way of speaking as not as useful as another way of speaking. So there's a lot of cultural cultural minoritization going on, I think. And
why should we be worried that this is happening, that so many languages are disappearing?
Yeah, some people would say, why not? And if this is the way to think the world is going, why not have one world language that will help everyone to communicate better? So they say we would have world peace. So they say, but actually, speaking the same language doesn't actually stop people from fighting at all. You can see that all around the world. Rather nasty civil wars going on, for example. I think you have to start from the point of view that diversity is a good thing. Mm-hmm. And we are seeing, more and more everything becoming the same throughout the world. We go to every big city in Europe and you've got the same shops and everything, and also all around the world now. It reflects in different ways of thinking, although I don't necessarily believe the kind of essentialist view that your language reflects your way of thinking or your culture. Language and culture are quite strongly linked, but it's more on a level of kind of a sense of identification, a sense of uniqueness. Okay, and this is often kind of portrayed as something that is bad. I think that's kind of, for example, detrimental to national unity, detrimental to educational achievement. But actually, what's been found is that if you support people's home languages, generally children will do better because their own identification, their own ethnicity, their own selves, if you like, are more valorized by that, by recognizing the uniqueness of their background and cultures. We find that I see. If you go back to the history thing, if people know where they're coming from, it's easier to map out where you're going to have a sense of stability, a sense of empowerment in the world.
I mean, you touched on it there, but can you expand a bit more on how history can help us understand what is happening now in the present with languages?
Yeah. I mean, decolonisation is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but it does go back a lot to the history of colonisation. If you look at this country, for example, first of all, colonised its own peripheral areas, if you like. So the history of language shift, of, if you like, domination of other cultures within this country goes back centuries, even millennia. And then, the same thing happened in colonized countries as well. And the ideologies were exported. The language of civilization. You have to have a written language, and a language that doesn't have a written form is inferior, for example. These things, the whole way of thinking gets exported. So if we look, people have come to think of now language revitalisation is starting to be thought of as a decolonising activity. So we kind of just kind of to copy a phrase, if you like, decolonising our minds from that mindset that you have to give up one language in order to learn another one properly. The majority of people in the world are multilingual, often kind of skip between languages depending on what they're doing, who they're talking to, what they're talking about. You don't have to speak all languages in the same way or about the same things. Multilingualism isn't necessarily about having lots of monolingualisms. It's about being able to use your range of languages for particular purposes. And this is something that's not really recognized by the establishment, let's say, in this country, who tend to see, language, as I say, language as a unifying factor rather than as something, we have to decouple the idea of cohesion and assimilation. They're not the same thing at all. Yeah, so you can have a lovely kind of multicolored jigsaw, of languages into each other. As I say, it's the important thing to get over, and the thing that linguists actually are quite bad at getting over, is that being multilingual is good for the brain, that children do better at school if they're multilingual. Multilingualism, bilingualism can actually help to delay the onset of dementia in older people as well. So all these things are really important to get over to the public.
And the importance, and if we move on to look at the implications, Julia, so for the societies where the endangered language communities live, for academia, for policymakers, what are the implications?
For communities, language loss is often experienced as a quite tragic event. And what I've seen is that not all communities, because they don't have access to academic literature necessarily, and it's not in a language they understand, they don't have access to academic libraries, they don't necessarily know that other communities, so many communities around the world, possibly more than half of them, are going through this very same process, this very same experience. So it's very difficult for them to learn from each other's experiences. So I said that can be quite traumatic, because what it means, as I said, is kind of losing a part of your identity, losing part of what makes you a people, if you like, and being told that this is what you have to do in order to progress. So my own mother said to me, it was holding us back, our traditional language.
Yeah.
Really, this is kind of mindset that we're trying to change. Yeah. I mean, for academics, we are, as linguists, we're concerned basically about the loss of our subject matter. If it's so selfishly, if we hadn't caught languages at a certain point, we wouldn't know that it was possible to say things in a certain way, or to have a language which has only got a very few number of consonants, for example. So for linguists, it's important to have that database But so the response of linguists has been to try to document, to record languages while it's still possible. But that doesn't necessarily benefit the communities. Yeah, it's the part of the rationale is that those recordings would be available to communities, but actually very often they're not in a format that's useful for communities. So one of the things that is trying to be pushed now is to try to make that link more to make useful materials for teaching languages, for example, reference materials that people can actually understand, rather than ones written in kind of linguistics, you know. Yeah.
I mean, we touched on there about responses, but perhaps, I mean, policymakers, ones that have most power, for want of a better word, what have their responses been?
Yeah. As I said, some governments, their point of view is that national unity is best served by having everything, education, just judiciary, etc., through an official language. And politicians will often see multilingualism as being expensive, as being a nuisance, basically. And so many governments take a kind of laissez-faire attitude towards language endangerment. Oh, well, we won't have to worry about that in a generation or two because they're on. Yes. But there are some governments who actually have recognised the value of multilingualism, of basically of giving everyone the chance to shine, you know, with through their own heritage. And actually, the European Union is quite good on that. The European Union actually funds promotion of minority languages, and there's been a lot of benefit from that. UNESCO as well has actually declared the next decade, but there was a year of Indigenous languages, I think 2019. And then I think because of the COVID, everything skipped a year. So it's going to be 2022 to 2032 will be the International Decade of Indigenous and Minority Languages. And that's going to focus on human rights. Picking your own, being able to express yourself, being able to be educated in a language that you understand. So many children around the world are not, you know, able to go to school and actually understand what's going on. Yeah. And obviously that's going to have a negative effect on education. So there's lots of things. So hopefully that, you know, hopefully that will have a knock-on effect on government policies. Yeah. Yeah. But there are, I mean, for instance, look at the Welsh government actually is now in, you know, every child learns Welsh in Wales. There are a large number of bilingual schools there, and you can even go up to PhD level and write your thesis in Welsh. And that's now being done in various other countries. New Zealand, for example, has got quite progressive attitudes now or policies now towards Maori. But you know, it takes a lot of campaigning, and I think we mustn't forget the bottom-up level as well, because language policies happen at every level, from individuals right up to, you know, international level. I talked about international level with regard to UNESCO, but down at family level, for example, it's, you know, it's down to what if a family has more than one language that's spoken by their parents. Do they choose to speak those languages with their children? Which languages do they choose to speak to their children? How do they speak them? You know, so many people have said to me things like, "Oh, well, when I went to school, it was drummed out of me. I was told almost that come back when you could speak English." You know, it's this idea that you can't do well in the national language if you carry on speaking your home language. You know, it's not an either or. It's, you know, you add to your brain capacity by adding more languages.
Yeah, I mean, that last point really rings true. I mean, when I was at school, we were encouraged, obviously, just to speak English, but at home I was, you know, Bengali was insistent that my parents said that we should learn it, and I'm grateful to them to this day. Looking at the UK and language uptake, why do you think it's fallen in recent years? And what advice would you give to someone thinking of taking a language degree?
Okay, this as I said, I think keeping up languages is really, really important. Yeah. We have seen it down, and it's partly to do with policies going back decades in this country that language has been underfunded. It's been assumed that teachers who speak a language don't necessarily need training to teach a language. There's lots of things going on there. So I think what's needed is to bolster language provision at every stage of education, go right down to not just at a university level, because it's much more difficult. It's to start a language at that level. Yeah, and not just the so-called modern foreign languages that are sort of European languages, and major languages such as Chinese and Japanese, but also to promote smaller languages, because those are the ones that are really interesting. It's much more interesting to study something that's new, something that's exciting. It will give you an insight into how languages work that are not like your own. It's opening up a whole new way of thinking for people.
Absolutely. I mean, Julie, we've already touched on this and how people are trying to stop languages dying. Can it be reversed? Can language endangerment be stopped?
I hope so. There have been many ways around the world that people have tried to address this. I kind of was touching earlier on going right back to preschool level. One of some of the earliest efforts around the world, actually in Wales is one of the earliest language revitalisation movements, but also in Hawaii and in New Zealand with the Maori language, we mentioned earlier. They started what they call language nests, where basically you get older people who still speak the language together with the young children to try, because what in a language shift situation, what often happens is the parents are discouraged from speaking to their children. So then you get a generation gap. You often get a generation who can understand the language but don't speak it fluently, productively. But then you get a generation who basically can't really talk to their grandparents quite often, which is a real shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes, the idea was to try and bridge that gap. And as those children got older, they started education, not just teaching the language in schools, which, as we know in this country, is spectacularly bad, but actually having education through that language. So what we call immersion education. So children, learn to do all sorts of things through that language, not just to speak it in very small kind of restricted areas, like you were talking about with your home, for example, to get the confidence to speak the language outside the home about all sorts of subjects. So that's one of the most common ways, is to do it through the school system. But there are also other ways which are more community-based, particularly in places where there isn't government support or regional government support. So, for example, there's something called the Master Apprentice or kind of mentoring initiative. And actually, one of my PhD students is looking at one of those in the Ryukyu Islands in Japan at the moment, so that basically tries to pair together older people who speak the language still fluently and younger people who are trying to learn it, or, as I mentioned there, perhaps the generation who understand it but aren't confident enough to express themselves in that language. And this is really good because, as I said, there's often this generation gap, and the oldest people who speak the language, the older they get, the fewer people they have to speak to. And so it means that they get more rusty and they get more lonely. I mean, loneliness is a big problem for old people in this country anyway. So to have a younger person who's interested, who comes along to your house regularly, that can help you around the house, for example, because this is a learning through doing kind of thing. So you can, okay, let's do some gardening, let's drink a cup of tea, let's do all that in the language that you want to recover, to reclaim, to learn, And that's, to me, that's a really, really good way of doing it, because it's a more community-based thing. Because what happens often in the school system is that children who will go through immersion education won't necessarily carry on doing that after they leave, partly because there aren't that many people to speak to outside the school, but also because they've learned school language and not necessarily home language. So you need a kind of backup thing. The language needs to leave school as well as be taught in schools. There are many other ways that people have other things. There's things like trying to have signage in the language. One of the things that people are quite fond of is to have tattoos in their heritage language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, we're touching on, there's lots of interesting audience questions coming in, so thank you very much for that. Okay. And we will be going through them shortly, but before we do, Julia, we touched there on reversing.
Yes.
But is revitalising the same thing? I mean, are there ways that people are kind of using technology, for example, or other ways of revitalising languages?
Okay, I mean, at the moment, we're all doing things via Zoom. We're all online. And that has been obviously something people have had to do more and more during the pandemic. So that's really come into its own. So in some communities, I've been talking to people in North America about what they are, how they have coped basically during the pandemic, how they carried on revitalising language. And what they found is that they're getting, in some cases, more people participating, because people can Zoom in who wouldn't have been able to attend face-to-face classes, or people who are also in diaspora communities are able to Zoom in and keep in touch with their heritage language. And actually, so that's been a bit of a boom in some ways. Yeah, I know that older people. Yeah, the only problem is that, the more isolated the community and the older the community members, the less likely they are to have a good internet connection at all. So I've been it's for a long time, some communities have done that by phone anyway. And I've been doing some of my work by phone at the moment recently too. People, you've talked about technology, and people tend to see a language app as a bit of a silver bullet.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, we've got to have an app for our language. Yes. We've got to get a language into the schools. It's got to. I see these as kind of developmental stages in language revitalisation movements. There's a very interesting guy called Peter Keegan in New Zealand, who's a Maori language scholar and activist. And he's been looking at the effectiveness of apps and such like for learning Maori. And you have to be careful, because, a piece of software is only as good as the technology will let it be. And sometimes online methods of learning, if you're using kind of games and stuff, or things like Memrise, Duolingo, for example, Duolingo Gaelic has been very, very successful in the last couple of years, particularly during the pandemic. But they have, because they are machines, they have a machine type way of teaching, which is not necessarily in line with more modern ideas about language teaching methodology. So you have to be really quite careful with things like that.
And Julia, I'm thinking perhaps more culturally, but what are the wider benefits of maintaining linguistic diversity? What do we all gain?
Okay, so you cut out for a second there, but I think you were asking about the wider benefits.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
There have been a number of studies in the last 5 or 10 years about that, and as I mentioned earlier, benefits for cognitive development, brain development, not just at children actually. Even it's been found that even starting to learn a language as an adult can be a benefit later in life. Keeping your brain active and keeping, yes, as I mentioned, it has been actually found in some studies that after the onset of, they feel like after dementia is diagnosed, being bilingual can actually help you to delay it for about 3 to 5 years, which can be quite significant for all the people. But there have been studies, for example, in Canada, in Australia, making, not necessarily, you have to be careful with correlation and causation, right? Okay. But in some Indigenous communities, there is a big problem with youth suicide. And in Canada, they have found in communities which have a language revitalisation program, that the youth suicide level is lower. And one can speculate that might be, for example, because, as I mentioned earlier, about valorization of their heritage, not being told, "Oh, you're wrong, don't speak like that" all the time.
Yes.
Yeah, and not being put down all the time for being from a particular background, as language is often a mask for racism.
Being made to feel other.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. In Australia, they have also found correlation between level of diabetes, another problem with Indigenous populations. So we're beginning, and also I have a colleague in Poland, Justyna Olko, who's been looking at language and well-being, particularly mental well-being. And part of the colonization experience for many people has been this historical trauma. And we've been looking at language revitalisation, language reclamation as a way of overcoming that. And that's a really kind of upcoming area of research at the moment. Basically, it's basically empowering power, if you like, of language reclamation. Yeah.
Fascinating. I mean, Julie, we're going to go to audience questions very shortly, but before we do, you touched on research. So where are you going to take your research next?
Oh gosh, okay. What I'm really interested in is trying to draw comparisons, parallels, trying to theorize about language revitalisation. I'm actually putting together a really big grant application at the moment to try to draw together experiences from people all over the world, and to look at projects from all over the world, but to also look at it thematically. So, for example, looking at immersion and empowerment and development, looking at things like Master Apprentice Initiative, that kind of thing, just seeing how they pan out. Will be a long-term, longitudinal study, so that and what's called an action research study, whereby you kind of you have inputs and you evaluate at regular intervals. So that you can actually kind of adjust what you're doing. It's a kind of like suck it and see approach, yeah. But to do that on a global level, this is really quite an ambitious study. I don't know if I'm going to get the funding, but I'll try again and again and again and again. So comparative and collaborative research, I think, is really important, and looking at things like language and well-being as well, yeah, incorporating that.
Well, all sounds very exciting, Julia. Thank you so much. And audience questions coming in thick and fast. Let me ask the first one specifically about the UK. Someone is asking, how many languages are in the UK and how many are at risk of disappearing? So how many languages are there in the UK?
Okay, so the UK, I think, has 7 recognised languages, and they are all autochthonous or indigenous languages to the UK. By some people's estimate, there might be as many as 300 languages in the UK, which coming from with people who come from all over the world, and most of those languages, frankly, are in danger of not being spoken so much in the next couple of generations. You have to be a bit careful because people don't like their languages necessarily being thought of as endangered or threatened or dying out, and that actually in a way can be a problem, because if they don't recognize it, then they're not going to do a thing about it. But it can there's also a lot of rhetoric about this, and to say something is dead actually is almost to make it dead. So people prefer to talk about things like latent, sleeping languages, for example, in Australia. But so many people will talk about living languages when they're trying to revitalise language, rather than focus on the positive, on the going forward, rather than on the death and the dying and all those negative terms that linguists like to use, like moribund and obsolescent.
Thanks, Julia. Jen is asking, she says that you mentioned concerns as a linguist about the rapid loss of your subject matter, i.e. languages disappearing. How would you, Julia, go about researching those that are already lost, and what sources can you use?
Okay, so a good example of this is Cornish in the UK, and Manx, which is not actually in the UK technically. So both of those languages haven't had any native speakers for some time. Okay. Cornish possibly for a couple of 100 years, although there's some debate about exactly that when. So people that both of those languages, there are written records. The Bible has been translated into many, many languages around the world, and that is actually quite a useful research, although quite specific in terms of language type. What happened with Cornish and what happens with many other, there are many languages around the world that people are trying to revive, to reclaim, if you like, from not being spoken at the moment. So you can supplement records which may have been made by local people, which may have been made by missionaries, which may have been made by linguists even, by looking at languages in the area as well. So for example, with Cornish, what they've done is to look at Welsh and to look at Breton, because Cornish is clearly on a continuum between Welsh and Breton. So you could look at, okay, so Welsh does it like this, Breton does it like this. We know because linguists can tell how like a language continue will work, and how particular sound will change between languages. So they say, okay, so this is how it would have been done in Cornish. Yeah. So then you have to think about, okay, so at what stage do we want to try and revitalize Cornish? Are we going to use it as a language of the present, of the future? Are we going to sort of focus on how it was spoken in the 18th century? There's lots of decisions and there's lots of arguments about that kind of thing. Yeah.
Interesting. And we touched before on diaspora communities. So someone is asking, what role might diaspora communities have in saving or revitalising languages? Isn't there a significant number of people, this is really interesting, who speak Welsh in South America? Is that true?
Apparently, yes. And likewise Gaelic in North America as well. And they're often like doubly disadvantaged because they came from a minority, and they're again a minority in the place we went to. And there have been lots of attempts to try and reconnect. Yeah, okay. But what's often happened is that because there hasn't been a lot of contact until recently, you couldn't like just pick up a phone or a computer and talk to your second cousin back in the in back home. Those languages may have changed where they're spoken. Then there's a question of, do you try and be purist and try to impose the kind of norms of the if you like standard language, if there was such a thing, or are you going to recognise the variety, say in Patagonia for Welsh, as Patagonian Welsh separate from Welsh? There's a lot of interesting debate going on about things like that. I know a woman who's looking at Texas Czech, for example.
Really interesting. So we talked about diaspora there. There's another really interesting question here. Looking at the other side, could new speakers of a language, so outsiders, help the process of language revitalisation?
Yeah, not necessarily as outsiders. Basically, if a language is really highly endangered, its future lies in new speakers, absolutely. And I count myself as a new speaker of my own heritage language during this year from Guernsey in the Channel Islands, because my mother's family didn't speak it. I may have heard a few words as a child, but now I have become relatively fluent simply through doing research, actually, through recording people, through talking to people. And having a language mentor as well is really, really helpful. I'm in a kind, yes, it's sort of one of those master apprentice type kind of relationships. Sorry, came back to the question.
How can new speakers help?
How can new speakers help? Yes. Basically by learning the language, by speaking with other people, by using the language as much as possible. Even if the person that you're trying to speak to doesn't speak so well, they're on a stage of the journey. A new speaker can recognize that it's hard to learn a language, that you need to take baby steps before you can take big steps. Because unfortunately, sometimes when you try to talk to fluent speakers and to older people, they don't have any experience of teaching languages, even not to children, because that stopped, quite some time ago. So I think, yes, as new speakers, we can play a really, really important role. And sometimes, new speakers are criticized for the way they speak. But as I said, that's all part of the learning process, right? And if you think about the way English is changing, kids, even older people now, saying things like "I'm like" and "she's like."
Yes.
You won't necessarily learn at school if you're learning English. Kids in the Manx Medium School in the Isle of Man busy making up equivalents in Manx for "I'm like" and "she's like." Which is horrifies some of the older people, the more traditionalists, if you like. But if a language had not been endangered, it would have continued changing, and really, change is a sign of a living language, of growth in a language. Yeah. So I wouldn't knock the way that young people speak languages. Any way they speak is good. Okay, and encourage them, and they'll get more fluent. Discourage them, and they'll give up.
Yes, so everyone go learn a language. There's a movement happening, someone's asking this, Juliet, there is a movement happening to return the names of landmarks and places to their indigenous language names. Uluru in Australia, for example, or the Welsh name for Snowdon, Snowdonia. Could, this person is asking you, Julia, could Julia also say anything about this? Does this help to bring indigenous languages to people's attention? What's your take?
Well, the fact that it's been in the news is bringing it to people's attention, and that it does raise the issue. It makes people more aware of what has happened. I mentioned colonisation process, and part of that was overlaying. Basically, literally wiping from the landscape the original names of places. Yeah, I agree fully that even if you don't want to use those terms all the time, just recognising that they are there and that they belong to the original owners of those places. Yeah, I fully agree with that. There's a very interesting play about Irish. I think it's called Translations. Which actually it goes back to this in a way, because what happened was that when the British came along making maps, they didn't understand the local names, so they got sort of bowdlerized. And the same with Hawaii as well. So there's a whole movement trying to find out what those original names were and to try to reconstruct them. And this is what we have to do, actually. And actually, place names are really important in going back to the previous question about trying to revive languages which aren't spoken at the moment. Actually, place names can actually be very helpful with that, because in some places they're quite descriptive, like White Hill, for example. So you learn the name for hill and the name for white, and then yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Another question, Julia, for you from Abu. Is there any international agreement on the format of documentation of endangered languages and an international repository for such documentation? Sorry.
Okay, can I ask two questions? Yes and no. Yes. So there are several repositories for depositing records in endangered languages. Until recently, there was one based at my own university, but that's moved to another university in Germany just now, the Endangered Languages Archive. And there are there are various ones all around the world. Some regional ones, like the Archive for Indigenous Languages of America. There's one called Paradisic, and I can't remember exactly what that stands for, but it's for Pacific and Austronesian languages, based in Australia. So there are quite a lot of these around the world, and there are international standards for the formats in which the data is deposited. So yes, in that respect. But if you relate that to the practices of language documentation, yes, there are sort of suggestions, guidelines of best practice But I would like to widen them a lot more, because I'm actually quite critical of the kind of way people go about doing language documentation. Because, as I mentioned, it's often for the linguist's benefit rather than for the people's benefit.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so a linguist will have an interest, say, in a particular way of saying a particular verb or particular structure of a language, particularly if this language has got a particularly interesting and rare structure. So they'll try to elicit that kind of thing from people, and perhaps forget to record things like natural conversations, greetings, excuses, all sorts of kind of regular day-to-day stuff. That are the kind of thing you need if you're going to try to bring your language back. Yeah. So that, I think, kind of thing really needs to be done more. Okay. But yes, in the beforehand, we were talking before this actual broadcast, we were doing sort of sound quality checks, for example, and that kind of thing is really, really important, because what's important is to have a multi-purpose record of the language. So whatever way anyone wants to do with it, will find that. And for that, you also need what's called metadata, data about data. So a list of what's being talked about. But say you can search. A guy I know was talking about, there's an archive in Alaska of Alaskan languages. And someone was looking for information about star constellations in a particular language, and they were able to find it because they had such good records of what was in those archives. Yeah.
Gosh, such an interesting question. Thank you, and great, fascinating response. Linda is asking Julia, what role do you think language testing and assessment have in the process of language revitalisation? Can they play a positive role, and what might this look like?
Language testing. Okay. Well, the thing about testing, if that's to do with language proficiency, the problem is that for the vast majority of languages in the world, we don't actually have those records yet. We're talking about language documentation, but we've hardly started to actually record the vast majority of languages in the world. There are about 7,000 languages in the world. Okay, maybe 500,000 of them are actually represented in these language archives. And also for a highly endangered language, we don't really have a picture of the full way of speaking that language in all domains of language use, in all areas of life. And we don't, for example, know what's the appropriate way for a child to speak in that language, what the developmental sequence is. That is still lacking. Okay. And it may have to be actually reformulated, as I said, with regard to reclaiming languages which aren't spoken at the moment. Yes, so it's very difficult to create language tests if you don't have the records of the language yet. But it's also touches on the question of standardization as well. Yeah. And some people assume that if you want to learn a language, you have to have a standardized written form. But that's sort of, if you like, that's, for some of us, is a kind of colonized mentality, if you like, because it reproduces the ideologies that made languages die out in the first place. So if you say, okay, there's one correct way of speaking this language, that actually cuts out all the people who speak in different ways. And what we find is that when languages start to fragment, you actually get more and more different ways. So endangered languages change faster. They have more what we call idiolects, like individual ways of speaking. And they're often not standardized. They have different regional varieties. So for example, in Guernsey, you can tell where someone's from within about half a mile, for the older people at any rate, by the way they speak. And that for me is a sign of richness rather than a deficit, okay? We have to perhaps turn on its head the notion that we have to have a standardized way of speaking and be tested in that, I'm afraid, in order to speak a language well. So my kind of ad hoc way of measuring fluency is able to have impromptu, kind of unprepared conversation on a range of topics for us, say half an hour or an hour at a time, rather than, for example, as we often do in testing French or German, for example, in this country, for the candidate to prepare a speech in that language, which is fine. It's a good thing to do. it forces you to kind of think about what you're saying, but it's not the same as having an impromptu conversation. Yeah.
So true. Very true. Thank you, Juliet. Sue is raising a topic that we touched on earlier. She says, I understood Julia to say that multilingualism delays the onset of dementia. Could you expand on that, on the evidence for this? Can you, Julia?
So this is not my research. It's been, because I'm not a psycholinguist, okay, no. So with a huge number of what's the word, caveats, okay, yeah. So it's and you have to say, okay, this is not going to necessarily, is not, if you make your granny learn Welsh, it doesn't necessarily mean she's not going to get dementia. Okay, it's not necessarily a cause and effect in that way. But basically, the idea is, or the understanding is that as I said, adding languages to your ability, if you like, capability, or adds capacity to your brain, and it helps, that neurons fire more. It helps develop more brain plasticity, and basically keeping the brain as active as possible is good for everybody. Yeah,
I would agree. I mean, I've read the same as well. I was happy I was bilingual after reading that. Adriana asks, Julia, could you recommend some readings on language reclamation and revitalisation as a way of overcoming trauma that Indigenous peoples have experienced?
Oh gosh, okay, this is quite a new field. Just started writing about this. So I reckon my work has been done by my colleague Justina Olko, O-L-K-O, at the University of Warsaw. So she started writing about it. A guy called Patrick Heinrich at the University in Venice has done work in Japan on things like this. There's a very good overall kind of overview of the language and well-being research by Doug Whalen, W-H-A-L-E-N, which is available online, open access. And with regard to language revitalisation in general, if I can make a plug for my new book, which does include a couple, it does include a chapter on that topic. Yeah. Or even more than a chapter on that topic, actually. So it's with Justina Olko, we've been putting together from our experiences in the last few years it's a practical guide to language revitalisation with lots of examples from people who've been involved all around the world. And that's also available free in open access online.
Excellent. Well, there we go. So this is a rather long question, but really a fascinating one from Jeanette. And she asked, some countries are formed by smaller ones, one or two states with their own indigenous languages, invited by a larger state to be a country. And in the end, the indigenous language have sort of been put aside to give away to the national language so that there is national unity, which, Julia, you have touched upon, and loyalty to the nation. Is the idea of the national language and using it for nation building a relevant concept in this day and age, given that the next decade is the international decade of indigenous languages?
Interesting. Yes and no, I think. Yes. I think national languages have their use. There's a very interesting book, or more than one book, I think, by a guy called Benedict Anderson, who called Imagined Communities, which talks about the rise of language and nationalism. And he identifies print journalism as one of the kind of ways in which national language is developed as a way of bringing people together as if you like, one nation. Okay. Mm-hmm. But as I mentioned, that doesn't necessarily preclude regional identity. And actually, there have been some studies that show that if you recognize regional identities and support in regional languages, that can actually support national unity rather than suppressing regional languages or identities. Because make people love you and they won't rise up against you. And has been seen in Spain, for example, when regional languages were recognised more, and various other places as well. By no means, you look at India, for example, it's got lots and lots of languages, and national unity is not really an issue. It's got a kind of like some countries have this, and not just in India. For example, some countries in Europe have this 3-language policy, whereby they teach a local language, the national language, and an international language, which is generally English. And that really works quite well, because you're valorizing all of those levels, recognizing that people want to learn a national language and international language, but also giving them the opportunity to connect with their local area as well, and their heritage. And that could also work for other heritage languages as well, not necessarily ones which are from particular regions of that country. If you've got a particular population from another place, then that could work as well.
Right.
Yeah, so many countries around the world, it's very difficult to actually sort out what's an indigenous language and what's, for example, in Thailand, where I've done a bit of work, and basically that area as a whole, there's been a lot of toing and froing. One of the groups that I worked with originally brought to that area as prisoners of war from Vietnam. So, are they an indigenous community? Are they not? Does it matter? What matters is to actually help them to overcome the disadvantages that they've been basically dumped on. Yeah.
That's a great answer, and we're getting so many really, really interesting questions. Julia, Karen is asking you, I've heard that multilingualism in children can initially slow down their speech development, but later fuels creative thinking in all areas of learning.
Yeah.
Could this be used as an effective argument for encouraging multilingualism in our formal education system?
Yes.
Yes. Resounding yes.
Yes. Yes, that's absolutely right. Yes, and people often may think that if their bilingual child is slower in developing speech, then that is a worry, and then at some point someone might come in and say, "Oh, you're just confusing the poor child." But persevere, because it really got benefits in the long term. Yeah, and absolutely, schools can play a big part. Both in supporting that, but also in being in working against that. I think one of the reasons why many minority groups are so keen to get their languages into school is because schools have been so good at killing languages.
Yes.
So it's poetic justice, but it's also like thinking, okay, so it was good at killing them, it's going to be good at saving them. There's a bit of a logic slip there, but but the schools can really, schools could put children down, or schools can support children. And you really hope that a school is going to help every child to do their best. Yeah.
From schools to big organisations, how would you, Julia, evaluate UNESCO's methods of protecting endangered languages? From the micro to the macro.
Oh gosh, okay. So when you say methods, what they have is I think what UNESCO does is support other people, to support indigenous groups in protecting their languages. UNESCO won't do it for you. The government won't do it for you. Actually, linguists won't do it for you. You have to do it yourself. Okay. But what UNESCO can do is to provide tools and material or kind of suggestions, basically, and put you in touch with people from around the world. And that's what I think is very valuable about these international opportunities, is to reach out and make links between people who may not know each other existed, who may learn a technique, for example, that they never thought of. But, that could work here. Okay, maybe we need to adjust. Yeah. Okay. It's important not to try to impose the same model on everywhere. So that yes, because places are different, cultures are different, histories are different. But yes, I think so. Bringing people together, sharing knowledge, sharing experiences is a really important thing to do.
And do you see any negatives in the way they protect these languages or attempt to protect them?
I was a bit concerned about a film that came out, I think, the year before last, which seemed to be sort of romanticizing language endangerment and language death. Okay, so what the danger is that you exoticize things. You show see the friendly natives dancing, yes, hear the friendly natives speaking in this exotic way, treating basically people like birds, for example. There are quite a lot of parallels drawn between language endangerment and other species, biological species endangerment. And I think that's partly because people prefer to think of like nice furry things rather than to think about the nasty political repression things that goes on, which is actually what happens in terms of language endangerment. Okay, so there's a danger of, as I said, of sort of exoticizing things, a danger of erasing the history. That we really need to know that history and be aware of it so that we can learn from it and try to put things right. And
perhaps shying away from the more uglier ways that languages are being endangered. And this from Emma, Julia, and I'm really interested to hear this answer as well. How can we get involved in helping to revitalise languages or showing our support for their revitalisation? What can we do?
Oh gosh, okay. There are societies. For example, in this country, there's the Foundation for Endangered Languages. You could join that. You could get involved in events. If there's a local event celebrating a language, for example, go along, try and learn a language. If you have a heritage language, try to talk to your granny. Try and speak your language as much as possible. Basically, yes.
Julia, we've now run out of time, sadly. Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation.
Well, thank you.
I have thoroughly enjoyed it. It was. I've learned so much, and thank you so much to our audience for your excellent questions. And do refer to the British Academy website and social media channels for details about future events, including one this Monday featuring Professor Sir David Carradine in his last event as President of the British Academy, in conversation with the international broadcaster Zainab Badawi. Julia, thank you again so very much. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.